Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Eddie Network podcast, and I'm glad you're here. And my guest today is Josie Gibson. She is an Australian and is doing interesting work in building, I guess, community. Is that a good word for it? Building collaboration. She's a creator of civic relationships that really matter. And I hope that's a good way of describing. That's the way I perceive what you're doing. And I'm really happy to have you here and to talk with you about what you're doing. So tell us a little bit about who you are. And I know that many of the people that are watching or listening have no idea. They don't know anything about Australia other than Crocodile Dundee, and which is probably the least representation of Australia. So tell us a little bit about yourself and about your country and in particular what you do.
Thanks so much for having me, Ed. And Crocodile Dundee is one of my favorite movies. It might tell just a little bit of the story, but I love it nonetheless. It's just fun.
It is a great
and it expresses a lot of the humor that's at the heart of being Australian. So I run a group of interesting change makers called the Catalyst Network, which is this 10-year experiment, which sometimes I'm still not completely sure what it is. All I know is that they're really interesting people who, when we get together, sparks fly and interesting collaborations spring up around the edges. That grew out of my interest in challenging thinking and practice around how we approach some of the big things that we need to do as societies. Because my training for many years was in journalism. I'd observed a lot of well-meaning change efforts and leaders stepping forward. And then you fast forward 10, 20, 30 years and you have to say a lot of fundamental issues still remain unsolved. In fact, they might have worsened. Mm-hmm. And so in the last 10 or 15 years, I've been running my own business. Once I left journalism, I had a lot of different kinds of roles, but I always came back to that issue of why is it that some people can get big stuff done and most of us can't? Like, what is it that actually those true transformers, and if you look back through history, you see them. They tend to appear once you're looking back, but when you're in the middle of it, it's quite easy to miss them because there's a set of characteristics around how such transformers operate. And so in the last 10 years, I've been looking at this in more depth to kind of understand, how these people operate to get big stuff done, and then how we might learn from that and actually more generally do things differently. And these people are everywhere. They're in every community. And they hide in plain sight. And that's, as the journalist in me loves that.
Well, that's really intriguing. It really has piqued my interest. So I want to know what these people are like. What is it that they're doing? What is it that they're doing which is, on the one hand, different than what the rest of us are doing? And two, what are they doing that we could all emulate? We could all follow and copy in a sense.
Yeah, look, they're really good questions because I'm not sure that copying is part of it. I think when I started to investigate this, I did the usual routes. I looked at some research around leadership models, and I looked at how, psychological models and frameworks around how we develop as adults. And I looked at complexity science, and I looked at systems thinking, and I even looked at quantum biology, because to me, and in more recent times, I've looked at Indigenous First Nations wisdom principles as well. And I mapped them all. I just, I went through a lot of red wine in my efforts to I'd find a new piece of the puzzle. And a lot of this material is rigorous, and it's been around for many years. It's just sometimes, when I think about some of the research, people were just ahead of the times. Like, they discovered stuff, but there There was no market for it. There was no appetite. But when you sort of pile it all on top of each other, there's amazing commonality in that the way these people operate is from a global perspective. And by that, I don't mean it's international. I mean, they go to the biggest, like they have a capacity, like a radar, to pull in stuff. And it's driven by curiosity. And that is more than just intellectual curiosity. And so I sort of started to put some words around it. It's almost like a calling that they know that there's something missing. And when I started to chat to people around this, so I call it outside in thinking, which it's not linear. It's just like pulling all that data in from many, many diverse sources and being able to sense make and recognize patterns, like in the most sophisticated way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to look at two groups. So I had sort of a fairly mature group of leaders that I worked with, but they would often send me, I was going to say, some of the baby catalysts that they would have. And these young people, the same sort of outside in thinking, but they would think that everybody thinks that way. And I'd say, no, not everybody has the capacity to kind of handle that much data for a start and then make sense of it. And then out pops something that's just quite novel but very practical. So one of the other characteristics that I sort of noted with the experienced ones, was the ability to deliver. So they would often be the people that step forward in the middle of a crisis. So say a bushfire or something like that. They just know how to do it, and people trust them. So this thing about trust taking years and years, there's something rolled into this way of being that enables them to do together with other people. And the other way that's quite different from what we typically see is they tend to work in coalitions. So they always work with other people and through other people.
Do you think this is something that's natural to these people, or is it something that's innate in who they are?
Yeah. And one of the challenges for the younger people who are kind of wired this way, and when I looked at particularly adult development frameworks, it's actually a handicap to operate this way in today's work environment, because they just go naturally to the source. So if you're young and you haven't got sponsorship within an organization and they say, look, here's a complex project, go do it, they will go do it, but they'll tread on a few toes and break a few rules, because they'll just go naturally to the people that need to be part of the conversation. So I know you're a king of conversations. That this is a core tool of how the people that I call catalysts really work, but a very sort of nuanced way. But the younger guys lack the experience to manage the politics of treading on toes. So without sponsorship, a lot of them derail. And so you sort of see these really talented young people who have these quite unusual innate characteristics completely getting missed in high potential talent pool, because they're not big self-promoters. But I can pick them from looking, you get them to tell you their story and how they work, and you go, oh yeah, you've got these gifts that can't be seen by the system.
Are you familiar with the term Neogeneralist? You know that term?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Very aligned.
Would you call these Neogeneralists?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's that, that term, I think it's the W, but that ability to sort of sit with a high level of abstract conceptual and then go and do it and then dip back in and out.
Right.
It's not a common, I mean, the data that I've looked at, the research, it's maybe 5 to 8% of the population actually are wired that way. But the good thing about all of us is that we can develop. But the current sort of development models don't develop us for that kind of complex environment. In fact, and I used to flog, management programs and leadership programs at a business school, and they flog processes that actually channel these interesting people into very narrow thinking, narrow doing models.
It's a specialized, they're training them to be specialized rather than general. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, well, that's fascinating, because what you're doing is, see, I think that the future will be determined or established by these neo-generalists. And if you know, Kenneth Mickelson and Richard Martin, who wrote the book, The Neo-Generalists, you know, what they say is that all these neo-generalists actually have a specialization. They have something that they really do well, and that they have to figure out what that is, and then focus on that with this big picture kind of environment. I mean, this is who I am. I mean, I'm as big a picture as I can be, because I feel like the entire world is my neighborhood. You know, it's my local community, and I know people all over the world, and these are the people I want to hang out with. You know, I love hanging out with them. You know, and so it is difficult, because the structure of the world, the institutional structure of the world, is not very compatible to these folks. So the question is, how do you help them deal with the structural obstacles and limitations that they face?
I had one of that's a really good question. I had one of the baby catalysts say to me one day, you know, super talented guy. Oh, look, I don't do politics. And I said, mate, if you want to actually have impact in complex environments, which you tell me that you do, whenever you get 2 or 3 people together, you're going to have politics. And so there's a sort of learning curve for the younger ones to come to recognize human nature for what it is. And I think part of it is understanding, holding a mirror up so they can see their own gifts, but see what other people bring as well. And the more experienced, the really accomplished, you know, executives and directors I've seen, they just accept human nature for what it is. And all of the paradoxes, the bad behaviors, but they, and I think of, you know, somebody like, you know, Nelson Mandela, able to, you know, wear the Springbok jersey while giving the African National Congress salute simultaneously, be in those 2 places at once. That actually takes experience to get to that point, and very deep self-reflection, and not everybody can do that. And that someone described it to me really well. It's you know, where does the ego sit within that? And this woman, it just stuck in my mind. She said, oh, we stand in front of the work. So they don't identify themselves through the work. And when the work is done, they move on. So it's not a kind of, but obviously you've got to have a very intact ego to do big stuff, but they can control it.
So what you're saying is that these projects, let's say there are projects out there, these projects are not about establishing or validating one's own sense of identity. Our sense of identity is established by our values and our sense of purpose. We go do it, we go apply them or exercise them in the context of these projects, but they're not going to tell us, they're not going to define for us who we are. So the success or failure is not a life-defining proposition for us in that regard. Is that the way you?
Yeah, absolutely. And the paradox of this is that, well, I think about you've traveled the world, you've got these amazing networks, and you're doing micro conversations with interesting people that you cross paths with. So it's being able to be in these different dimensions simultaneously. Not all of us can do that. And there's something so humbling when I meet new people. We had the opportunity to host an absolutely wonderful cultural astronomer who's been a pioneer in the field this week, who is just brilliant, but also totally humble at the same time. you know, a groundbreaker. And in, you know, Kenneth and Richard's book, there are many such people. And so it's that creative tension, if you like, between, oh, I can do this. Oh, can I do this? I must do this. All of those questions simultaneously. And then they do it. They have no choice, in my experience.
So what was the instigating moment that brought you to this awareness? Where did this begin for you?
Ooh, I'll answer that in two ways. There's a sort of personal track of my own story. So I've created a group that I want to be part of, basically. So it's all about me. But I think the genesis of the Catalyst Network, I had been in business. I was, you know, still trying to change the world in business with people who were trying to change the world, getting quite frustrated that nothing was changing and starting to pull back at, like, something's not right about all of this. You know, we're missing key bits. What is it? You know, again, the sort of torrent of egos that exist in the change maker space. It's just phenomenal. And I was just getting a bit bored with it, quite frankly, because they're quite tedious, really. And so I pulled back, and I was then sort of immediately sucked into another collaboration with somebody who said, oh, you bring people together. I think, you know, why don't you bring people together? Because I'd noticed a lot of senior people leaving with burnout, like quite high value creators. It was around a year or so after the global financial crisis. I would go in to sort of pitch my wares, close the door of the boardroom, sit down, and they'd burst into tears, or they'd sit slumped at the board table. And to a person, they would say, I can't do this anymore. I can't get the leadership team to see that we need to do things differently, or the board, like, they're not hearing me. And I'm out of gas.
Yeah.
And so this collaborator said, oh, bring people together. So I called it Leading in Complexity, just plucked the title out of a bottle of red wine again, and got 20 people turning up for a 2-hour conversation in Sydney around leading in complexity. And I'd run membership groups before, and I'd vowed I'd never, ever, ever do it again, because while I had a lot of fun, it's a tough business.
Yeah.
But I sat in that boardroom in Sydney listening to people download, and there was a lot of pent-up frustration, and, you know, I thought, this is really interesting, because these are fine people. Why are organizations allowing them to walk out the door? Why are they not doing their darndest to hang on to them? And then, of course, my Melbourne networks heard about the Sydney thing, and I had to do another conversation down there. And pretty soon I had this sort of core group of people, and I didn't know what to do with it. And after a while, my collaborator at the time, it was all a bit hard. So I was left with this group of people. And that was when I thought, well, I can't, you know, these conversations, bringing people together, are really, they're telling me this is something that sustains them in their work. Because they were doing, a lot of them were doing really pioneering stuff in very, very difficult circumstances. And, you know, we've just had some of the big management consulting firms implode in Australia, which I have a lot of friends who work in consulting, but there is a bit of schadenfreude, I've got to admit, watching chickens come home to roost, because they sort of muscled out a lot of the really interesting people who were creating new stuff and transition models that, say, governments could have used during the pandemic, or you know, community development teams could have applied. So in this turmoil, I just kept going with this group, and the Catalyst name came to me one day when I was thinking about how they work, which is they never work alone, but they set off this chain reaction and then they move on. And there's this bit of alchemy of knowing who to bring together and then moving on. So there's a lot of, it's a very sort of specific dynamism that I could feel from people. And when I sort of looked at myself and thought, oh yeah, that's how I've operated. So
is this a shift that's taking place, and I'm suggesting it is, but I'm asking you the question, is this a shift that's taking place away from the traditional hierarchical institutional structure to one which is much more of a network of people, network of collaborators, where they're working together, and I go back to Robert Greenleaf, who was the creator of servant leadership, and he talked about how teams should be operated like by a first among equals. The person who has the talent or the expertise for a particular thing, they're the ones who take the lead at that moment, but they're not always in the lead. There's this kind of collaborative way of operating where everybody leads and everyone follows, and out of that dynamic, out of that, the energy of that interaction is where the real change process emerges. Is that shift taking place? Is that shift something that you see taking place?
Absolutely. And I mean, you know Richard Martin and Kenneth as I do. Richard wrote a beautiful piece around cycling pelotons years ago that, like, as a metaphor for me, was really strong. And I think, I really hate the term leadership. I really hate the term leader, because it's not really useful. When you think about how life really is, it's only within organizations or within institutional structures that someone takes that title. I'm much more interested in people who step forward and step back and help others get things done. Do you call them leaders? Maybe, or not, but it's just not and it confuses people. And particularly in a country like Australia, we are just indoctrinated into authority because we still haven't cut the ties to the mothership. So, authority represents something, roles represent something, and it may be that way in the US as well around, certain offices. I'm interested in the people that can look at that and go, oh yeah, but I don't care. I'm going to go around them anyway. So there's a sort of very graceful rebellion that is part of the makeup of the people I'm interested in. What is it? Do it anyway and ask forgiveness. Don't seek permission, that kind of model. And I'm seeing more and more of that. And we can get hung up about structures, but in my experience, really good operators, they just can work within any environment. So, and I hear this, people become addicted to ideologies that are actually pretending to be change theories. And I think about, the teal organizations and things. And like, I come back to, Sapiens. We just decided as a society at one point to say corporations were people. Well, they're not.
No.
An organization is just a group of people who get together who decide to do something.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I began my leaderships, when I began my consulting work in the mid 90s, I began to see patterns of behavior. I talk about patterns of behavior. And there were three patterns that I saw. One was the lack of clarity about ideas, lack of clarity about values, purpose, vision, things like that. And in particular, people had no idea what impact was. And then there was this lack of understanding about relationships. And as that idea developed, what I saw was that lack of understanding of relationships meant that there was a lack of respect, a lack of trust that was being developed particularly in business between people, because that meant that people would have to be open to the other person instead of being in competition. But the real problem was the fact that the structure was kind of dominant, and the structure had had such a lack of clarity, and as a result, it was totally inward focused, and the efficiency of this structure was the thing that dominated everything. So ideas and relationships are all kind of subservient to this idea that efficiency was the god of the institution. And what I came to realize is that it's the opposite. We start with ideas, we build relationships, we come up with a vision for the impact we want to have, and then we say, what kind of structure do we actually need to create this impact? And I think that's where we're headed. I think we're more likely to be willing to jettison ourselves away from those structures which are such obstacles, and say, okay, what is it we actually need in order to make this idea that we share together effective in the world.
I think you've just beautifully expressed what true co-design is.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my beefs with the change industry, the change maker industry, is a lot of these terms are sort of tossed around, and it could be, you know, my journalistic bullshit detector, but very few people, I've come across very few people who can actually sit with the realities of what you've just described mean, which is a hell of a lot of flux, uncertainty, fuzzy edges. Oh, those danged people, you know, how are we going to find a way? And it takes as long as it takes, right? And so I'm particularly interested in, you know, big projects. I've worked in, you know, the construction industry and these big mega projects that take multiple years, and how when they work, they generally have people with the capacity to adapt the way you've described. When they don't work, which is, you know, 90+% of the time, they have people that just cannot cope with the prolonged uncertainty and messiness of it.
Well, the reality is that structure is never on the table for change. We're going to create change within the structure we have, but we're not going to change the structure we have. And therefore, we're going to stay the same way, and we're going to have the same problems. But what I saw emerging from the pandemic was people were deciding, because they got sent home and they were working from home. I like working from home. I don't want to go back. So if they're going to require me to come back, I'm going to quit. I'm going to go find another job. And I think that's a really healthy thing. I greet that with a lot of, all right, let's see where this goes, because it's the kind of change which can't be controlled very easily.
Yeah. I think what you raised in the pandemic is an interesting one, you know, watching so many people grapple with it. It just, to me, just pulled the curtains open on our failure to actually have real conversations about the social contract that we call work, and how that needs to be shifted. I've seen very few organizations have that conversation. I see very few people in leadership positions that are even interested in having that conversation.
Yeah, and this is my explanation for why that happens. You know, there are people who they start at some level within the company, and they show that they have a particular talent, and they are performing at a high level, and they're rising through the ranks. And all of a sudden, because of that one particular thing that they're really good at, they find themselves as the CEO, and all of a sudden they realize that they're isolated, and they don't really have all the skills needed to do all the things that the C-suite needs to be doing. And they were never taught how to be the leader of a collaborative team. So they're in real trouble. I think the C-suites of most corporations are in real trouble. And if they recognize that, then they can actually step out of the office and go down where the workers are, and ask them, so what should we be doing? And if they were to ask the workers and the middle managers what we should be doing, they will find out actually what will change and sustain the quality and the livelihood of the organization.
So you asked about if I'm sensing change, and yes, I feel like there's a closure of a whole lot of cycles of different durations. Maybe one's about 30, 40 years, maybe one's many hundreds of years if you talk to Indigenous elders, around stuff that we actually know in our hearts and guts actually works. And that's why I'm really interested in what First Nations are generous enough to share with us around their principles of operating, which are always relational, and not just relational in a people sense, but relationship to land, to the earth that sustains us. And I love that notion of custodianship. And I've actually sort of started to kind of work out how I can use that in my work when I'm a custodian of an opportunity, rather than coming in to do a plan. What does that actually mean? You know, and it's a very different sort of, like, who do I need to bring in at what point for what kind of decisions, for what kind of actions? You know, there's this wisdom of millennia. We've got the model the wrong way around. We only go to the people at the end of when everything else is blowing up. But in Indigenous cultures and most parts of the world, especially collective cultures, they start with the people and then they go towards action. But there are certain steps where they hear everybody's voices, they see what resources they've got, they design around that, then they do it.
And what the leaders see is the importance of holding the tribe or the community together by constantly referring back to their shared values, their shared history, their ancestral values. Those things are really important as a way of connecting people back to what is meaningful and important for them. That's what I see in tribal groups or in indigenous groups. I've seen that, and I only see it because I studied those things, and what I realized was, and this is a phrase that came to me 3 or 4 years ago, and it's that there's in all these organizations, and I would suspect in your tribal groups there, the indigenous groups there, that there is this persistent residual culture of values that persists because it resides in the relationships of the people, and that is what the real culture of the tribe is, or what the real culture of the company is that culture of values which all the people or the people share together and becomes kind of the defining ideology for the company or for the group.
I am such a novice when it comes to, you know, Indigenous cultures, and we're lucky in a place like Australia now with our, you know, less than glowing track record around treatment of our First Nations peoples, that they are generously sharing so much of aspects that they can of their sciences, their cultural principles, that to me makes so much sense, particularly when you look at things like the failure of collective climate action over the past 20 plus years. You know, lots of talking, not a huge amount of progress. Because we live in Australia, in a continent that is one of the driest on earth.
Right.
And we're fortunate to have peoples who've been here for over 65,000 years. So I would say they know a thing or two about how to adapt. And so I've been wrestling with this, and it's not been a popular sort of train of thought in the context, but I've just thought climate is a second order priority. We need to actually reconcile with First Nations and be able to have different kinds of conversations. And through that, we will actually get access to that wisdom of millennia around how to deal with, how to adapt to whatever the earth and the climate is dealing us.
So I think that leads to the conversation we had before we went on the air, which has to do with your sign there, Vote Yes, and which is a campaign. Let's talk about that, and because I think that campaign, if I'm not wrong, fulfills that kind of sense that you're talking about there. So let's talk about that. What is this campaign that you're
okay? So yeah, I'll put myself out on a limb. I feel so strongly about the potential here, the possibilities for Australia in this part of the world, that I decided that I would actively campaign for the yes, a yes in a referendum that we are holding towards the end of this year around changing the Australian Constitution to recognise our First Peoples by establishing a voice to Parliament. As we were talking about before, we came on air in 1967, which is still in my lifetime. We had a referendum where the Constitution was changed to count Indigenous Australians as citizens and not flora, so not plants. And Australians overwhelmingly supported that referendum. But we have a track record in Australia of being super conservative about change. I'm a big proponent of a republic. So I remember the bitter disappointment 20 years ago when that referendum was defeated. We don't like change. We're a conservative society here. But I feel that we've been given so many signs and opportunities to do things differently. And the generosity of Indigenous Australians to continue to offer us the opportunity to have conversations around this and access some of the science and the wisdom around healing this continent and making it more sustainable is an opportunity that I can't pass by. But it's a vexed conversation for some people. And I think the process that led up to this referendum, which is a process of 7 or 8 years in different parts of Australia, I find fascinating and inspiring, because it's just been a series of conversations building up to a beautiful invitation.
Does this lead to a parallel group that then becomes a collaborative group with your current group of First Nations, First Peoples, who are catalysts in the sense that you're talking about, that you create a second group of these people so that the two groups can come together in ways where that collaboration, I mean that's creating a structure for relationships that could really be significant. I mean, that it seems like that's your opportunity.
It's so exciting, and as we've discussed, if this referendum passes, and we have a very poor track record of passing referendums, you have to get a majority of votes in the majority of states, so it's actually stacked against passing. But the Indigenous elders who came together in Uluru to create the Statement of the Heart, they wanted to go directly to the people of Australia, not through government, but directly to the people. And I think part of my work as somebody who believes in the yes vote is to go and have conversations just like this with other people who may be unaware that there's a referendum. I mean, there's a lot of younger voters that have never had to vote before who are looking at me quizzically, why are you wearing a yes t-shirt? Because you're going to have to vote before the end of the year in a referendum. What's a referendum? And then you have this conversation. You know, and there is resistance and antagonism, and not only from white Australia, from different pockets of First Nations. So it's, you know, there's a lot of residual anger, and I'm sure this is all part of this process in different countries where you have to be able to sit with it. So I'm coming in sort of, I don't want to be clumsy in the conversations. I want to be respectful. So we shall see where it goes. But that's my commitment, and it's been the commitment of a lot of my friends to go out and talk to their neighbours, and that's what we're doing.
Well, I wish I lived in Australia, because this sounds like an exciting moment for the country. I mean, this is a kind of moment of reconciliation, and that's a very big deal. So you know, of course, this is the way I think. So what if if you found someone who represents the First Nations, and that the three of us would have a conversation about this? We could do a podcast on this, and without there being any kind of agenda or anything like that, but we just have this conversation, the kind of conversation that we would have if we were sitting in a coffee shop having coffee, or having a walk, and we'd have and we just hear one another. And here I'm the outsider in all this. I'm just going to be the kind of that person to ask the hard questions. But I would love to see that happen if you're interested in doing that. I mean, that's exactly what this podcast is about, is creating those kind of conversations where people can talk. And I just lay that out to, you know, and I think it's worthy of conversation.
Well, I'll see what I can do, Ed. I'll see what I can do. I think, like, as you say, I just have this feeling that it is the possibility of reconciliation is too good to walk by. And I also have a fundamental belief in the goodness of human nature on the ground. And interestingly, you know, some of the techniques, such as they are around because a lot of people say, I want to help, but I don't know how to have these conversations. I can't, you know, things have been so polarized. And so there's some material there around how to have, you know, good, respectful conversations.
Yeah.
And interestingly, a lot of it has come out of grassroots organizing, campaigning in the US, you know, from many, many years ago, that kind of really effective, connecting, enriching dialogue.
If we just listen to one another and respect that the other person's perspective is theirs and theirs alone, hey, we can do it. We can accomplish a lot. I mean, it really, I just see this as a very exciting moment for you all. And, you know, love to support you in that. And
thank you.
Yeah. Because if we can show people how to have a conversation with people who are different than us, without there being, even when the cultures are different, if we can have that conversation where we listen and we respect the other person, then we have a chance to create trust, and then we have a chance of being able to talk about the larger issues of the kinds of obstacles that we're both facing that are very similar, and therefore we are able maybe to work together to alleviate some of those things.
I mean, it's interesting. You can think about this as a problem, or you can think about it as a possibility. And this sort of ability to frame and reframe, you know, back to our original, you know, the early part of the conversation, is something. I met this remarkable woman yesterday who's worked in different industries and sectors. And we were talking about how you can choose to see barriers. You can choose to call it a problem, or you can say, this is really cool. What if we do this? If I'm within orbit, I want to go with the possibilities. I don't want to, you know, and yet we've come out of 10 or 15 years where classic problem solvers, reductionist thinkers, are the ones who get rewarded. And, oh, that's fluffy language, or that's, you know, that's too nebulous. Well, no, it's not. It's actually fundamental to attracting people.
So this, I think, and this is what I love to see when I have these conversations, is to see a moment of real, it's a catalytic moment of seeing, okay, there's an opportunity here. So I think we have an opportunity here, and that excites me. And if we don't, I mean, if we decide that it's not worth following through on, that's fine. I mean, that's not the point. You know, the point is that, okay, we're gonna address ourselves to the opportunity. If we see that the opportunity is really not going to work out, okay, maybe it'll come back another time. Who knows? I think it's not becoming. I think the challenge is not to personalize our own lack of ability to make something happen as something that's a reflection of us. It isn't a reflection of us. It's just that's the situation that we have found ourselves in, and so, but we keep the intention there always for the next opportunity that comes along. So obviously, you're doing really important work. It's really clear to me, and probably in a rather unsung way. And so what I'd like to know is how people, particularly in Australia, can find you if they want to become involved in what you're doing, if they want to talk with you, if they want to kind of come to grips with what it means to be a catalytic individual in the context of their work or their community or wherever it may be.
Yeah, well, thank you. Buzz me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty much off most other social media these days because of the echo chambers that it represents. I'd rather put my creative energy into other things, but I'm still on LinkedIn, so connect and we'll set up a chat. I have met so many interesting people through LinkedIn. I met Richard and Kenneth through LinkedIn many, many years ago and met them both, because I have a policy and I will meet you face-to-face or IRL, Ed, at some point. That's a threat, because I think as part of, real relationships, we do need to sit down and have a cup of tea or a glass of red together. That physical proximity actually helps. And the fact that we have been able to navigate the pandemic and the technology platforms and things and still have marvelous conversations, I think, is one of the miracles of being in the 21st century that we don't take for granted.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for the work you're doing. I think it's really important. I think it's a game-changing kind of thing that you're doing. And I think people should recognize this. And the people that you're working with should be congratulated for the work that they're doing. And so it's really great to have had you here and to have this conversation. And my head is just spinning with all kinds of ways of thinking about the opportunities that it's not just in Australia, it's everywhere in the world, of what the kinds of things that you're talking about. Those possibilities really are there for all of us. And so
the one last encouragement I'd have for people is this is the time to step forward and to be visible, because it has not been really safe for people who embody a different kind of, we'll call it leadership. It hasn't been safe. But now we need people to step forward and actually act differently and lead differently and show people that we can do it. And we know we can do it, but we just need to be more visible.
That raises the huge question of where does one find the confidence to do that you just suggested? How do they find that?
Oh, well, accept the invitation to be on a podcast, which I wouldn't have done 5 years ago.
Well, if you want to be on the podcast with me, just send me an email. I'd be glad to talk with you about it. I'm really glad to have you here. I'd like to meet some of the people that you're talking with and have more conversation about this. I think it's really important stuff, and it's a representation of something that's taking place in the world, which is a real change that's happening that is very difficult to identify exactly what this change is and where it's going, but it's certainly leading us from where we were to where we're going to be. And so people like Josie are one of the frontline people who are doing this. And I'm, when you reached out to me, I and I saw that your word was catalyst. I just thought, okay, this is going to be good. This is really good. And it really is, because to be a catalyst is that you're walking into situations and you're going to create change. And not just any change, but change which brings people together. You know, you're the catalytic force in that group that then expands so that things happen that are really beneficial.
And we're everywhere. So thank you so much for having me, Ed. It's been a beautiful conversation. I love it.
Well, give my best to all the Australians who are sitting on the fence, wondering whether they should vote yes. And as an American who believes in racial reconciliation, of joining together to talk about things that matter to all of us, I believe that what you're doing is really an important thing. So thank you.
Thank you
for your support of that. And thank you all for watching the Eddie Network podcast. Please subscribe and hit the like button. And if you have a comment or question, please let us know. And certainly I'll pass on your questions to Josie. And we'll put contact information in the show notes so that if you want to talk with her directly, you can do that. Thank you, Josie.
Thanks so much, Ed.
See you soon. See you soon.
See you down under.
And see you all soon as well on the next Eddie Network podcast. Bye-bye.